Okay, guys, so we're going to be talking about Act 1, Scene 3. Is this recording? Yes. We're going to be talking about Act 1, Scene 3 of Macbeth here. So we've already had Scene 1 and Scene 2, in which we've been introduced to the middle of the kind of chaotic war that they're in. But we haven't met Macbeth yet. We've had the witches in Scene 1 talk about Macbeth. We've had the king and his lieutenants talk about Macbeth in Scene 2. And now Scene 3 opens once again a heath near Forres. So we're back in the middle of the battle, and I want you to just note how it opens with thunder once again, in order to show the entrance of the three witches. We've got more kind of chaos and sound and all of that sort of stuff happening, continuing the atmosphere that we were talking about. So we have these three witches again returning, and we've got some kind of fun little lines to introduce the witches and to really show the audience they're evil. I mean, this first interchange, "Where hast thou been, sister?" Killing swine. It's just their hobby, you know. What have you been up to? I've just been killing some animals. So it really kind of almost tongue-in-cheek highlighting how evil these witches are, right? But there's a little story that the first witch tells here, when the other witch asks where she's been, which I think is really, really interesting and key. It often gets overlooked a little bit. So she tells a story of how a sailor's wife had some chestnuts that she wanted. She showed up and she said, "Give it to me," and the sailor's wife basically said, "Back off. You can't have any of these, right? Give me," quoth I. "Aroint thee, witch," she cried. So what does this witch do? Well, we know these witches are powerful. We know these witches can do... You would have thought that the witch is going to just, I don't know, kill her and take her chestnuts. But no. Instead, the witch finds out that the sailor's wife's husband, the sailor, is gone on a ship off to Aleppo. She's going to follow the ship. She'll sail, and like a rat without a tail, I'll do. She'll chase the ship down. And the second witch says, "I'll help you out. I'll give you a wind." And then she says she'll get into the very ports that they blow, and she'll get onto the ship, and she'll find the sailor. She says, "I'll drain him dry as hay," which is both an indication that she's going to like do bad things to him, but there's also a sexual implication here. It was very much believed that witches who were mostly female would kind of seduce good men and do sexual things to them in order to turn them evil, right? And then she's going to haunt this guy, and even she says, though his bark cannot be lost, so she wants to basically sink his ship, but she can't do that. But she's going to haunt him, and she's going to make his life miserable, and she's going to make it horrible. Now, why is this interesting? Why is this an interesting little story? A couple of things. One, it's important to point out the language here. We talked before about the witches talking in rhyme, and we get this again here. "In a sieve I'll thither sail, and like a rat without a tail." They read like they're reading poetry, and it adds that supernatural kind of mysterious element to them. "Wary Senites 9 times 9, shall he dwindle, peak and pine." Nobody else talks like this in the play, and it really helps to separate them from the mortal beings. But secondly, we learn that the witches are not all powerful. She can't just do whatever she wants. She asked for these chestnuts, and this good, God-fearing woman was like, "No, back away, witch." And so she had to back away. So what does she do? She goes to hunt down her husband. She seduces him. She haunts him. She turns the husband mad. That's her plan, right? So we see that these witches do not have ultimate power to do everything that they like in this play. But what they do have power to do, the way that they get to things, is through the minds of men. And that's really, really key, okay? That's why this has been presented here. We get this introduction to witches, and that's what a big fear about the witches were, that witches were going to corrupt good men. And that's exactly what they go on to do with Macbeth, right? And so as a little introduction, we get a sense that this is the way that witches work. They don't just do whatever they like, but they find men that they can corrupt and that they can seduce in a variety of different manners, and then they make them turn evil. So this is kind of a little, tiny little story that almost reflects the story of the whole play to some degree. The literary term for this is synecdoche. A synecdoche is when a smaller thing can be seen as a metaphor or a symbol for the entirety of the whole. And here's like almost a mini example of witches corrupting someone. So, moving on. We got our entrance of Macbeth, and Macbeth's first line is, "So foul and fair a day I have not seen." Now this echoes the witches in Act 1, Scene 1. Fair is foul and foul is fair, okay? And we have, once again, this mixture of the natural order being turned on its head. Now he's referencing the battle here. It's fair because they've won, but it's foul because it's been a horrific battle and loads of people have died, right? And so violence and victory are already being melded together with this line, okay? To win something, it almost has to be bloody. It has to be fair and foul in this play. They come across the witches, Macbeth and Banquo, and they're both a bit like, whoa, who are these crazy people? There's some lines that kind of reference how weird they are, you know, so withered and wild in their attire, so they're dressed really weird. They say, "You should be women, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so," suggesting they look like women, but they've got big beards, so they're androgynous, they're not one particular gender, and people did believe this about witches at the time. So Shakespeare's very much setting the play up and the audience up into that realm where we go, okay, these are some pretty supernatural, horrific witches that are showing up here, right? Now the witches deliver the three famous lines of this play, the three prophecies, which is, "All hail Macbeth, hail to thee Thane of Glamis," which he is. "All hail Macbeth, hail to thee Thane of Cawdor," which he is now. We just learned in the last scene. He's just been made the Thane of Cawdor, but Macbeth doesn't know this yet. So there's a bit of dramatic irony happening here, where we as the audience know something, but Macbeth doesn't know. And then finally, "All hail Macbeth, thou shalt be king hereafter." So they tell him he's going to be king. Now, Banquo does a little bit of like, whoa, what's going on here? You're giving my partner all these noble predictions, but what about me? And so the witches give Banquo a prediction. They say, "Lesser than Macbeth and greater, not so happy yet much happier, thou shalt get kings, though thou be none." So they're saying that in his line, his children will be kings, but he's not going to be a king. Now, this is obviously deliberately ambiguous, and it's deliberately confusing. What does "not so happy yet much happier" mean? And those paradoxes are very much the way that the witches speak. Note the way that they respond, though, okay? Particularly Macbeth. Macbeth says, and we'll see this a few different times, "Stay, you imperfect speakers. Tell me more." Macbeth immediately wants to hear more, okay? He's not intimidated by this. He's not worried by this. He hears there and he says, "Come on, tell me more. What's going on here?" Now, a lot of people would be scared of witches, want to run away from witches, but not Macbeth. I suppose that makes sense. Macbeth is our bloody executioner, our man of action. He's not scared of anything, right? So they show up. They give him a prophecy. He says, "Hold on, tell me a little bit more." He says he knows he's the Thane of Glamis, and this is a really interesting line when we start to think about how he starts to get seduced into this prophecy. He says, "How of Cawdor? The Thane of Cawdor lives, a prosperous gentleman, and to be king stands not within the prospect of belief, no more than to be Cawdor." So he's saying the idea of being king is crazy. It stands not within the prospect of belief. Nor does the idea of being Cawdor. He's equating the two, because he knows the Thane of Cawdor is alive, or he thinks he knows the Thane of Cawdor is alive. So by equating the two, he's putting them on an equal footing. This means when he finds out that he is actually the Thane of Cawdor relatively soon, in his head, that makes the possibility of being king suddenly not within the prospect, suddenly within the prospect of belief. It's not mad anymore, because he originally thought being the Thane of Cawdor was not believable, and yet for it to suddenly happen, he starts to think, hold on, what about this king thing then? Right? And once again, he tells them to speak more. "Speak, I charge you," and then they just vanish. They bubble away into thin air. And note, once again, that Macbeth says, would they had stayed. He wanted them to stay. Banquo never says this. Banquo is less taken in by this, perhaps because he's not been told that he's going to become king, but just generally speaking, he's a bit like, his response is, were such things here as we do speak about, or have we eaten on the insane root that takes reason prisoner? So Macbeth is saying, stay, I want to hear more, and Banquo is saying, hold on a second, are we going crazy? Like, this is not normal. And then they have a little bit of banter between the two of them. Your children shall be kings. You shall be king. And Thane of Cawdor too, went it not so? You almost get the sense that they're kind of mocking what they've just heard. Like, this is a bit ridiculous, guys. And then, perfectly on time, enter the Thane of Ross, who rushes in and delivers the news that we already know. Right? Delivers the news that we discovered from Scene 2, that the Thane of Cawdor has been captured, executed, and that that title has been given to Macbeth. So that's that discussion there. Now Banquo responds, what, can the devil speak true when hearing this? This is key. If you look at this whole scene, Macbeth never describes the witches in any evil terms. He doesn't call them evil. He doesn't call them devils. He doesn't call them Satan or anything like that. Banquo does. Banquo is clearly much more aware of the evil of these witches, or more willing to accept the evil of these witches, than Macbeth, who kind of sees them as this kind of ambiguous form that isn't necessarily good, isn't necessarily evil, and we'll look at that a little bit later on. Now, key bit of imagery here that I want you to look at. Macbeth replies, the Thane of Cawdor lives, why do you dress me in borrowed robes? Now, I want us to think and look and annotate every single time Shakespeare uses the idea of being dressed in clothes that don't fit you, because it happens a lot. Here, Macbeth says, why do you dress me in borrowed robes? And this imagery appears quite a lot. Now, if you think about what we've talked about with King James and the idea of succession and the idea of divine right of kings, we can think about how Macbeth taking on roles that he should not have the right to have is really key, okay? And then the imagery here is being dressed in clothes that don't fit him. That it's not his right, it's not his divine right to have this position. He's trying to take away from the natural order of things. And so he is therefore dressed in borrowed robes. Keep an eye out for that imagery. It's a recurring piece of imagery that shows up quite a lot in the play. So, more discussion, we get more details that we already know. You should have read this scene already before watching this. So I'm just picking out key things here, not necessarily talking through every single line. Okay? But, just before the end, there's a little discussion between Banquo and Macbeth, where they think about what they've been told. Banquo says, that trusted home might yet enkindle you to the crown. So he admits, look, you've just been given Cawdor, that might make you think about the crown, right? But 'tis strange, and oftentime, to win us to our harm, the instruments of darkness tell us truths, win us honest trifles to betray in deepest consequence. This is a really key line. Banquo is well aware that these witches are evil. He calls them as instruments of darkness, again here, just like he called them devils earlier in this scene. And he says, yes, look, they might be telling the truth. They did tell the truth about Cawdor. But this is how witches work. They tell you truths in order to seduce you into doing something bad. To win us to our harm, to get us to do something bad, to harm ourselves or harm others, the instruments of darkness tell us truths. Win us with honest trifles. So they try and trick us by being like, here's something that's actually true, in order to make us betray something, ourselves or other people. Okay, so Banquo is very well aware of what's going on here. But how does Macbeth respond? He says, two truths are told, that's the Glamis and the Cawdor, as happy prologues to the swelling act of the imperial theme. So he's just described what's just happened as prologues to the next act, which is him becoming king. There's a kind of meta imagery going on where he's talking about his position in terms of a kind of narrative, a drama here. And it almost gives a sense of inevitability. Macbeth's almost telling himself, well, if these two things have happened, then I must become king. Because if these two things are true, the third thing must be true as well. And he thinks that these are happy prologues to a swelling active imperial theme. He seems quite pleased with this idea. And then, aside, him talking to the audience, so we have a little mini moment of Macbeth introspecting, he says, quite different to Banquo, cannot be ill, cannot be good. He accepts that these witches are not necessarily ill or not necessarily good. Or rather, he accepts that the truth that he is Thane of Cawdor and that he might be king is not necessarily ill and not necessarily good. His argument is that truth is truth. Truth isn't bad, truth isn't good. Truth is just what it is. Okay? He says, if ill, why has it given me earnest of success commencing in a truth? If this is a bad thing, why are things going so well for me? Why was it honest? Why was it truthful? These are interesting questions here, but you start to wonder whether or not he's perhaps starting to justify things to himself. And we get this kind of weird, morbid fascination come out of Macbeth here. Why do I yield to that suggestion whose horrid image doth unfix my hair and make my seated heart knock at my ribs against the use of nature? Present fears are less than horrible imaginings, my thought, whose murder is yet fantastical, shakes so my single state of man that function is smothered in surmise. He's already starting to think about murdering the king. Now, nobody's mentioned this to him. Nobody said you have to kill the king in order to be king. And yet, we've got to remember that Macbeth is a man of action. We've seen that from the beginning of the play. He can't not act. He's not someone to sit aside and just to see how things play out. So already his mind has jumped several paces forward and started to think about, okay, hold on a second. If I wanted to be king, what would I have to do? I'd have to do this, I'd have to do that. Oh God, that's horrific. And he's already really kind of thinking about that. And Banquo notes this. He say, look how our partner's wrapped. So wrapped means kind of all caught up in his thoughts. Then Macbeth says, and this is a really, really interesting moment for Macbeth. He decides, if chance will have me king, why, chance may crown me without my stir. So he's saying, if it is fate, if it is prophesied that I should be king, well, regardless of what I do, that's going to happen. So, without my stir means I don't need to do anything. I don't need to stir the pot. I don't need to change any way in which I act. Either it's true and I become king, therefore, great. I don't need to do anything, it will happen. Or it's not true, in which case I shouldn't do anything. So he's going to let things play out. But we kind of know as an audience that that's not Macbeth. He's kind of telling himself this, but this isn't the Macbeth that we've been introduced to. Someone who sits aside and lets things just happen around him. But that's the conclusion he's come to at this point. Once again, Banquo brings up the imagery. He's saying new horrors come upon him like our strange garments. So garments is clothes. Once again, the idea of the clothes he wears are strange. They don't quite fit him. They don't quite fit what he is. Anyway, they come to the end of the scene, and Macbeth basically just ends by saying, Banquo, let's not tell this meeting to anyone. Let's chat about it later when, we've had some time to sleep on it. He says, think about what hath chanced, and then at more time, the interim having weighed it, let us speak our free hearts to each other. When we have a little bit more time, when we've thought about it a little bit, let's share what we think about this, but let's not panic right now, and let's not tell anyone. They end, and they leave. So interesting things to point out here are the differences in the way that Banquo and Macbeth act towards the witches, the way Macbeth rationalizes his way through what he's hearing, and the way that he tries to see these truths as not evil, but kind of an ambiguous thing, something that's not evil but not good, just neutral. And I think there's a suggestion here that by Shakespeare that this is how men are seduced to evil, by tricking themselves into not seeing evil when it's in front of them, tricking themselves into thinking a little bit more neutrally about the subject, right? Banquo seems to get it much more clearly than Macbeth does in this situation, but Macbeth is already a little bit seduced by this power, a little bit seduced by this image of himself as king.